this event is taking place on unceded, stolen and occupied native land, and that an important part of our campaign is recognizing that history and standing in solidarity with Indigenous people in Canada who are standing up to colonization and theft of their land and continued oppression. This event is held under the auspices of the International League of People's Struggles Canada, and the issue of criminalization of people's struggles and attacks on people's right to resist has been an important issue for the ILPS since its inception. And especially since the current chairman of the ILPS, Jose Maria Sison, was in the early 2000s, 2003 I think, included on the EU terrorist listing, and that inclusion was used to violate his rights as a political refugee. He's managed to win the struggle to not be included in that list, but we know that that's a struggle that many people all over the world are facing, of this criminalization. And then of course the movements that are specifically targeted by the terrorist listings and the increased criminalization of people's struggles. I'd like to invite Angie Ipong, who is a political prisoner from the Philippines who spent 6 years in prison for her work with Indigenous people and peasants, organizing for their basic rights, was criminalized and called a rebel and charged with all kinds of trumped up charges, and managed to survive that experience.
Our voices will not be silenced. Burly men in long arms, some in bonnets, barged into the room, handcuffed me, dragged me into a van, blindfolded me. Brought from camp to camp, incommunicado, no benefit of a counsel, illegally detained, tortured, sexually molested. Charged with the most heinous crimes, fabricated, trumped-up charges, all non-bailable. Considered a criminal, a terrorist, an enemy of the state. Enticed with the sweetest words and promises, sugar-coated bullets to make me give up my principles. Locked in jail for 6 long years, only to be dismissed of all the charges imputed in me for lack of evidence. All these sadist acts to break me, to keep me silent, shatter my dreams of freedom and justice. But why do you want to lock me in jail? To keep me silent, to break me? Are you afraid that I will continue to teach our children correct values and make them responsible grown-ups? Are you afraid that I would let people know their rights, get them out of the culture of silence and the shackles of exploitation and oppression? Are you afraid that I work for the empowerment of the oppressed, exploited peasants, the workers, and all marginalized sectors so that they will rise up and make decisions for themselves? Are you afraid that someday your rotten system will be crushed and will crumble down to pieces for a new and just world to emerge? But our voices, the voices of the poor, the exploited, the downtrodden, will not be silenced. In the face of freedom caught in chains and the harsh brutality we encounter, the burden of the heart is heavy. But we will continue to struggle, no matter how painful is our suffering. We will never lose hope. We will fight to the end, no matter how long it takes or what it costs, until we establish a community of free men and women in our land, deciding together, working and striving together, but also dancing and singing together. For the gongs of justice and freedom will always prevail. Free! Free all the political prisoners!
Free! Free all the political prisoners!
So our first speaker is Mary-Mia Clamor. She's a doctor from the Philippines and one of the Morong 43 health workers who were imprisoned for 10 months on trumped up charges, basically targeted and imprisoned for their commitment to doing health work in the poor and peasant communities Angie was talking about.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Clamor. I'm a community doctor of Council for Health and Development. Our organization is a national organization of more than 60 community-based health programs in the Philippines that advocates for poor and marginalized people's rights for accessible, affordable, democratic, and quality national healthcare system. I and 42 of my colleagues, including another doctor, a nurse, and 2 midwives, and community health workers, mostly mothers and peasants from the far-flung communities, were having this first responders training when we were raided, arrested, and detained by some 300 military and policemen in full battle gear. They have these long arms, and they even told us that they have tanks and military trucks with them when we were arrested. We were not able to see it because we were immediately after they entered the resort where we were training, they put guns on our head, blindfolded us, and handcuffed us and put us in a van. And then we later on realized that we were brought into a military camp. We were accused by these militaries as member of the rebel group, New People's Army, and so we were not allowed to have a council. We were incommunicado for 6 days, deprived of sleep, and subjected to different forms of mental and physical torture, and sexual harassment and indignities. We were threatened that we will be killed, that our families will also be killed if we don't admit their claims. And for 3 long months, we were in their hands with daily interrogations and more threats and coercions, and even our families were not spared from these threatenings and coercion. We were able to see them, our lawyers, after 6 days, and we learned that after 11 days of our detention, they filed false charges against us for illegal possession of firearms and explosives. Of course, it was the truth. We have witnesses to tell that they brought all these firearms and explosives with them when they arrested us. Under a semi-feudal and semi-colonial society, it is but inevitable for the oppressed to be critical of the government's policies and programs that are not serving the people. And unfortunately, in our country, healthcare is not spared from politicking, corruption, and neglect, so that health services become inaccessible and more irrelevant more than ever. So aside from giving services to the people, usually in the far-flung communities, our group is really dedicated and determined to empower the people by providing them with knowledge and skills in building their capacity to improve their health, because the government does not provide health services to them, especially in the far communities. And we also advocate and we organize the communities for them to assert for their right to health. And we advocate on different issues to help healthcare system be more relevant to the people. So we advocate for increased health budget, but because in our country, we only receive 2% of the national health budget for healthcare. And that means 99 cents per person per day of budget. We are almost 100 million in population, and so if we get sick, it is really catastrophic because the government cannot provide us with free health services, and we have to from our own pockets, we have to get them. And because there is widespread poverty, unemployment, landlessness, they have hard time, and most people, 6 out of 10 people in our country die even without even seeing a doctor. So that's how hard it is for us. So, and of course, we know the exodus of healthcare workers in our country. The doctors, we are the #1 exporter of the nurses all over the world. We are #2 exporter of doctors, and most of our healthcare workers go to other places, including here in Canada, to work as live-in caregivers or as nurses or as nanny, because in our country, we are not paid well. We are overworked and underpaid, so we cannot really blame all our kababayans in going out of the country to look for a better financial remuneration. And all these factors really are contributing to the mass exodus of healthcare workers. So we are left back home with very dismal healthcare system. And for us, the ones who choose to stay, because we felt the need for providing our kababayans at least our small contribution to provide them with healthcare services, this is what is happening. And because of our criticisms, this does not apparently sit well with the current neo-colonial regimes in the Philippines, especially during the time of Miss Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. And with the guidance and support of the U.S. government, it has unleashed the bloodiest counterinsurgency programs. So back in Arroyo's time, it was Operation Plan Bantaylaya or Freedom Watch, OBL for short. It's a systematic approach to attack the leaders, the members, and supporters of the legal and democratic mass movement in our country. So they would just tell you that you are front of these rebel groups, so you are also target for liquidation or elimination by the government through the counterinsurgency program. So in those 9 years of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, in the name of counterinsurgency, the government claimed more than 1,200 victims of extrajudicial killing, 206 individuals were forcibly disappeared, more than 1,000 victims of torture, more than 2,000 victims of intimidation, discrimination, displacement, hamletting, and food blockade, and all those human rights violations committed against our citizens. And these forms of violations are often directed to the human rights defenders, including activists, the students, the workers, the peasants, and this does not spare the community health workers, because we go to far-flung communities. They would say, oh, you are sympathizers of the rebel group because you are here to treat most likely the New People's Army. But we would tell them, we have Hippocratic oaths. We, regardless of color, race, age, and political affiliations, we have the duty to serve and give medical services to the people. But they don't recognize it, and they would just brand us and vilify us as communist members, hence the human rights violations against us. Not only in the far-flung communities, even in the suburban and the urban communities, they are victimizing most of the development workers, the activists, and those critics of the government. However, in these 9 years of Arroyo's counterinsurgency, OBL, it has miserably failed in silencing the broad democratic mass movement of the people. On the contrary, every act of violence was met with defiance and inherent reaction to fight the oppressors. Since 2001, even if we are under threat of being killed, of being disappeared, or filed up with trump-up charges and be imprisoned. There was no let up in the mobilizations, fact-finding missions of the solidarity missions, pickets, and quick reaction, which accelerated in the height of the extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearance in 2006 and 2007. Thousands were mobilized, and international solidarity really helped us in drawing attention. Hence, international groups, even the United Nations, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial and Summary Killing, visited the Philippines in order to investigate these matters. And true enough, he found the link and charged the increasing human rights violations against the citizen to the security forces themselves. So, but unfortunately, we have a new president, but upon his current administration, he made clear that it's still the pillars of the new counterinsurgency of the United States of America will be used for counterinsurgency programs. So the internal peace security program is patterned over the United States COIN, counterinsurgency program. Hence, the killings, disappearances, tortures, and detentions of the civilians have not stopped. He has not been even there for 2 years, and we have 68 victims of extrajudicial killing. 9 has disappeared, 55 victims of torture, and hundreds of forced evacuation, especially in the mining areas in the Philippines. So, because he just continued what was the counterinsurgency program before. It is now called, with a better name, it's Operation Plan Bayanihan, meaning cooperation, but cooperation among them to target and violate our people. But even we were jailed for more than 10 months, and we still have 348 political prisoners languishing in jail. We don't lose hope, and we would always remember the lessons and the inspiration drawn in our experience as political prisoners, as human rights survivors. We don't want to be called victims because we survive it, and now we won't be silenced. We will continue to do our share to put a stop to this human rights violations happening in the country. So the campaign on Morong 43 was a big success because we were only jailed for 10 months. Unlike others, like Tita Angie, 6 years, we have some there back in Bikutan, where we were jailed for 11 years. Some were 18. So it's really unprecedented, the campaign. But it is because people saw what is happening, and they did very well in pressuring our government to release the human rights, the community health workers who are serving in place of them. And so with this lessons in mind, we share our story to all the victims of human rights violations, and we will continue to work hand in hand with our brothers and sisters in the Philippines and all around the world to continue to fight for human rights. Thank you.
So our second speaker is Gord Hill, and Gord is the author of the 500 Years of Resistance comic book, and he also has a new one out which is about resistance to imperialist globalization. He also was an active organizer with the Olympics Resistance Network, and he's going to talk about the criminalization of Indigenous people's struggles in Canada, which of course is very long-standing.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Gordon Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation on the northwest coast, northern Vancouver Island. And I was going to talk today about, along the theme of today's gathering, its right to rebel, mostly criminalization. So to start with, criminalization is a counterinsurgency strategy for delegitimizing resistance movements. And in North America, this kind of criminalization, it couldn't really occur until colonialism had reached a certain stage where it had entrenched an occupation, like colonial regime, and then was imposing its laws and regulations over Indigenous peoples. So it's more of a recent phenomenon. It's not like 500 years ago Indigenous peoples were being criminalized in the Americas, because that was a stage of anti-colonial resistance and warfare between nations. Today, the criminalization is a common strategy of states when they're trying to repress social movements. And I have a quote from a book. It's from a book entitled "The Trial of Leonard Peltier." Leonard Peltier is one of the longest imprisoned political prisoners of war in the United States. He was imprisoned he was captured in 1976 and sentenced in 1977 for the deaths of two FBI agents on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He's a member of the American Indian Movement. So the quote is, it states, "The state cannot merely overtly repress behavior which is considered a threat. It must also legitimize that repression. If the state engages merely in outright repression, it runs the risk of destroying its hegemony, which relies on people believing it is a neutral arbiter. The state is compelled to maintain a legalistic image if it is to limit political collective resistance. The state solves this inherent problem by appealing to the legal system. This enables the state to dispose of the threatening political behavior while simultaneously legitimizing its repressive acts." And the way that the state does this is by portraying resistance movements as being motivated largely by criminal intentions or criminal gains or criminal goals. And the example I'll use for this is the 1990 standoff at Oka. It's commonly referred to as the Oka crisis. It involved primarily the two Mohawk communities of Kahnawake and Kanesatake. Around the spring of 1990, the Mohawks in Kanesatake, which is also known as Oka, it's a municipality. Oka is a white township, and Kanesatake is a reserve adjacent to it. The township of Oka was trying to expand a golf course and make a condominium project on some land that the Kanesatake Mohawks considered very important to them. Right, it had burial grounds in it, and they used it to play lacrosse. It was the last forested area that they had. So they started a small protest movement to protect this area called the Pines. And over the months, they set up a little blockade on a dirt road that was hardly ever used by anybody. But anyway, in July 11th, the Sûreté de Québec, which was the Quebec Provincial Police, raided their blockade. And at the time, the Mohawks in Kanesatake, they had sent out runners to all the other Mohawk communities, and within the Six Nations, they're part of the Iroquois Confederacy, so they had appealed for assistance. And one of the main groups that had come to their assistance was Mohawk Warrior Societies, which had formed in the early 1970s as part of the liberation movements that were occurring around the world, you know, the 68 revolt and all that. So anyway, the Mohawk Warrior Society were in Kanesatake to help defend this blockade and this protest group. As the police went in to carry out their raid, they had a heavily armed tactical unit, and they opened fire on this blockade. The armed warriors returned fire, and in the shootout, a police officer was shot and killed. And there began a 77-day armed siege, which initially began with a large deployment of police, about 2,000 police, the Sûreté de Québec and the RCMP. And in August, the police were replaced by the Canadian forces, who deployed a mechanized infantry brigade of about 5,000 soldiers with armored personnel carriers and tanks, air support, naval support in the St. Lawrence River, and whatnot. So during the crisis, the standoff, the government and the Canadian forces engaged in a campaign of criminalization against the warriors, portraying them as largely a criminal organization that were involved in smuggling, gun smuggling, drug distribution, and these kinds of activities. So this was one of their efforts to delegitimize this armed resistance. But what happened was Native peoples across the country mobilized in solidarity with the Mohawks, with this armed standoff. So there was blockades and protests and occupations all across the country. And British Columbia had the largest number of blockades and protests because of the history of colonialism here, and there's a high level of awareness among Indigenous peoples that the land here has been stolen, and a big part of that is the lack of treaties here in the province. But this large Native mobilization was a real threat to the state, and they saw the potential for a broader Indigenous resistance and even insurgent movement developing here in Canada. And this was what really limited the state's ability to use military force during the standoff. Now what happened after that was the state and some of its right-wing think tanks did an analysis of what happened during Oka. And one of the main reports or analyses that came out was issued by the Mackenzie Institute for the Study of Terrorism. And their report, in a brief summary, was basically the deployment of the military against this relatively small, lightly armed group of warriors served to make the warriors appear as a legitimate defense force defending territory and defending Indigenous peoples. And it made the conflict appear as if it was like a military resistance kind of thing, which it was, right? But they didn't like that perception. The optics weren't very good, because it looked like you have an anti-colonial resistance force defending itself against this very, very powerful state military. So their thing was, what you got to do is you got to take your police forces and better prepare them and arm them for these types of standoffs in the future, because these standoffs are going to occur. So their basic recommendation was you got to have better armed police, and it's got to be kept at a policing level. And this is a basic concept of criminalization. So in 1995, there was two more major incidents involving Indigenous peoples. One was in southern Ontario at a place called Ipperwash, which began as a reoccupation by Indigenous peoples, retaking some of their land in a former military base and provincial park. And the Ontario Provincial Police, they were adopting this recommendations. They sent in several hundred heavily armed police who had a Bison armored personnel carrier, which was loaned to them by General Motors in London, Ontario, where they manufacture these armored personnel carriers. So this conflict ended in there was these people weren't armed. The protesters weren't armed. They were just militant, but they didn't have any weapons. But the police went in and with a heavily armed unit that opened fire, and they killed Dudley George. They shot a 15-year-old youth in the back, and they killed a dog during the shootout. So this had a big impact. But at the same time, there was another standoff occurring here in BC in the south central interior region at a place called Gustafson Lake, which is near 100 Mile House, and it's in the Secwepemc territory. And for the Secwepemc, it's known as Chapatin, which means big lake, and it occurred around this lake, Gustafson Lake. During this standoff, these people were armed. There was about 24 people. About 12 of them were armed, and to deal with this, it started as a Sundance camp, and there was a rancher, an American rancher up there, who wanted this Sundance camp moved off his leased property or whatever. So what the government did at the time, and the government was the New Democratic Party, right, the Social Democrats. So what the Social Democratic Party did was they deployed about 500 RCMP into this remote rural area where nothing was being blockaded, no infrastructure was being interrupted or anything like that. Anyway, they sent in about 500 heavily armed RCMP, mostly emergency response team members. A lot of them were from urban areas, these ERT units, and they also got from the Canadian Forces 8 Bison armored personnel carriers with the crew, the driver and an assistant, to use these machines to drive in to the area. And on September 11th, 1995, they ambushed a group that were using a vehicle to drive to get water. They had, there was negotiations. This was supposed to be a safe, no shooting zone that the people could go and get water and whatnot. But the RCMP ambushed them with an explosive charge, blew up their truck, and then they rammed it with these Bison APCs, and then they opened fire, and there was thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds fired that afternoon as the defenders defended themselves, and they disabled one of the Bison APCs. Anyway, these examples are how this criminalization strategy is put into effect in recent history here in Canada. The use of heavily armed police and trying to keep everything in the criminal, legal justice kind of level. And what they did during the standoff at Chapatin in particular was portray these armed defenders as being really motivated by a criminal agenda, which was words the RCMP used, called these people squatters, said that they were connected to a New World Order cult, and any means they could use to smear these people as illegitimate. They released the criminal records of people, many of whom weren't even in the camp. All these kinds of dirty, underhanded methods that the RCMP used. And there's a classic training video that the RCMP, they were training this whole operation to be used for future counterinsurgency operations of this nature. And there's a famous quote from the RCMP Sergeant Montague where he states that smear and disinformation campaigns are their specialty. And one of the elders from that standoff, Wolverine, he's a Shekwepmek, he had a counter to that. His thing was that the RCMP, everything the RCMP knew about this counterinsurgency, they learned from the FBI. Because you could look at the history of the counterintelligence program in the United States where they conducted exactly the same type of activities. And it's really important to know this about what happens in Canada and the United States, where they have domestic counterinsurgency campaigns, a history of it. In the 1970s here, North America, there was dozens of people that were liberation fighters who were killed by the police and paramilitary forces. On the Pine Ridge Reservation alone, there was about 50 people who were killed by a paramilitary force known as the Goons, the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, who were a militia unit used by the tribal council. So anyway, I've run over my time. This is basically what I wanted to convey, was that this history of resistance and repression exists here, and to kind of outline what this counterinsurgency strategy known as criminalization is. And just as a final note, I would say that a lot of this comes from the British. The British had a long history of colonialism. They employed this criminalization campaign. You can study Northern Ireland, where they use it against the Irish Republican Army, the Republican movement. They criminalized as being a bunch of mafia mobsters who just wanted to make money, this kind of stuff. But anyway, my time's up. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be on the panel with other people from resistance movements. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jose Figueroa, and Jose is a longtime resident in Canada who has been recently threatened with deportation and criminalized for his association with the FMLN in El Salvador long before he came to Canada as a student, I believe.
First of all, I want to thank Martha for inviting me on this event. Actually, the first when I heard about this, I didn't hesitate to click I'm attending to this event because of the topic. The topic, it applies directly to what we are facing right now as a family. And another thing, we have in the panel a friend of mine that we met in Toronto. and he's going to be the last speaker. And we were talking about this situation that has been dealing, that we have been dealing for over 2 years now. And as a matter of fact, it's not a recent situation. I have been, my family have been living here in Canada for over 14 years. We have 3 Canadian-born children, and immigration issued a deportation order in May 5th, 2010. To make things just a little bit, most of you here will know who Nelson Mandela is. Yeah, just raise your hand. I think everybody here will know who Nelson Mandela is. Well, the allegations that the immigration used in order to issue the deportation order is that I am a member of an organization, or I was a member of an organization that Canada believes is or was a terrorist organization. That is something that is contained on a section of the immigration law, section 34.1, that is criminalizing anybody who at one point in life they were supporting an organization that was looking for human rights in their respective countries. We have people from Philippines. We have people, actually, this morning I just went to First Lutheran Church here where Mikhail Lenikov is still waiting there for a decision from immigration. The topic itself, I think it has a big connotation here. It is right to rebel. And I think that that is even contained in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. If you read on the preamble of that declaration, it actually refers to the right to rebellion as a supreme right. It doesn't say those words in the English, but if we translate that into Spanish, and we make a literal translation of those words, the right of rebellion is a supreme right for people. When the governments, dictatorships, are using every means in order to control, in order to oppress the people. And that is specifically what happens in El Salvador. FMLN, the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front from El Salvador, they led the Salvadorian people into a struggle to get rid of that oppression that we were facing during the decade of the 80s. In a 12-year period of the civil war in El Salvador, more than 80,000 people died. And another thing, this dictatorship was being backed up by the United States of America. At the beginning of the civil war in El Salvador, Ronald Reagan, his administration, they started or they continue the economic support to the military in El Salvador, even though they knew that the Salvadorian government were using death squads in order to control any opposition in that country. They knew for sure, and actually George Bush, who was at that time ambassador in El Salvador, they recognized and they warned the Salvadorian government that the use of death squads were going to damage the image of the Salvadorian government. Yet they spent $1.5 million a day for a period of 12 years in order to try to control something that they thought it was a threat to their government. The Salvadorian government was in the eyes of the United States as the next step after Nicaragua. They overthrown the dictatorship of Somoza. So that's in a bigger background. what we can see on what these allegations have been brought up. Now, when we are looking at this, in January 2010, I was called for an admissibility hearing here in Canada. That was the first time I heard about the allegations for the deportation order. And I even didn't know anything about the immigration law. And I was forced to represent myself into this admissibility hearing due to the fact that we didn't have access to economic resources to hire a lawyer. In some ways, that kind of helped us in order to try to understand more about what is going on with immigration here in Canada. And this section, Section 34.1, has been applied to many people from Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador. There are so many cases, but in this particular case, there are so many contradictions that they are being established. First of all, I have made this public. The reasons for the deportation order that was given, the adjudicator says, well, I don't see anything wrong with your actions. They're trying to make to support an organization that is trying to promote some changes in a country, especially when death squads are being used. There's nothing wrong. But I have to give you a deportation order because you were a member of this organization. And to top it up, well, in Canada, the Salvadorian diaspora is over 150,000 Salvadorians. Okay, from many of them, they were welcomed into Canada as refugees being members of FMLN. So this is a matter of applying a little bit of logic. Well, they are finding me inadmissible into Canada simply because I was a member of an organization that supported FMLN. Now, if we go a little further, what are we going to find? That, well, if we are saying that Canada is standing for what is justice, then they should start a process of deporting hundreds or thousands of Salvadorians that right now are members of FMLN. So I think that this is leading us to, well, we have to be thinking, what is the logic on this situation? At this moment, the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Immigration, they need to answer two applications that we apply. In 2010, October 2010, we presented an application for ministerial relief application that is based on Section 34.2 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. In that application, the Minister of Public Safety could decide, well, this person is not a threat to the security of Canada, and he can stay. Despite the admissibilities, he could decide. He hasn't decided that. And we know that statistically, with that, he could take 7 to 9 years to decide on that application. I mentioned that there were two decisions that we are waiting for. In the year 2004, the minister representative of the Minister of Immigration representative, they approved in principle an application for humanitarian, based on humanitarian grounds. Now, on all of this, when we came into Canada, CIC, they knew about my relation with FMLN. They knew the first day we presented our application for refugee claim, they knew that I supported FMLN. So that wasn't a secret. And they didn't come up with allegations of terrorism, because that's what they are saying, that I supported a terrorist organization. In the year 2004, still, when they approved in principle the application for humanitarian grounds, no allegations of terrorism were brought up then. these allegations of terrorism are brought up 13 years after the fact that we came into Canada, which doesn't make any sense. So these are many factors that we need to consider in order to have an objective analysis of what is going on. At this point, in 2009, FMLN, that rebel group that was fighting against the Salvadorian dictatorship, they formed government. And right now, there is a Salvadorian ambassador who is member of FMLN. So, where is this logic for the Canadian government dealing with this? If I am being found in a missive just for having been a supporter of this organization, that means that the diplomatic representation of the Salvadorian government should be inadmissible. And right now, at this point, they haven't said anything about these allegations, and we are waiting for a response. In my views, I will be better off if the Canadian government came up with allegations of terrorism, because that way they will have to prove that I belong or I supported a terrorist organization, and they cannot do that. Well, the fact that right now I am speaking right in front of you, if I was a terrorist, where should I should be right now? I should be in a place where I shouldn't be able to harm any Canadian. So there are many things that we need to be looking at, but I think that it is right for the people to speak up about what these problems are. Right now, I have my kids here. I have two of my kids. My son, who was diagnosed with autism in the year 2002, and my little girl, Ruby. She's only 4.
She's very cooperative.
They are all Canadians. So the Canadian government cannot apply these allegations or this deportation order without violating their rights one way or the other. If many persons say, okay, Jose, in his statements, he says that the family is being deported. And, well, somebody told me, oh, I have read the decision and only his names appear on the deportation order. Their kids aren't under a deportation order. Well, it is not on the name, but in the end result is the same. A deportation order against me and my wife can be translated automatically as a deportation order against my kids who are Canadians. So where are their rights be standing up in this situation? So I guess that just trying to get into this is how can we fight this situation? Well, we have to refer that the community needs to be more active in to learn about the law. They are applying the law in order to criminalize certain actions, even though they make no sense to whoever can come up with some recent ideas. So this doesn't make any sense, or does it? So some times ago we were talking about this thing. I was invited to a program called TED, T-E-D, where we were talking about this concept about terrorism. What for some people are terrorists, for others are freedom fighters. And at this point, 20 years ago, I made a moral decision to support FMLN because they were trying to make changes to a society that was being oppressed in our country. And those changes were good. And I think that many people are still struggling in El Salvador. The Civil War ended in 1992, Canada supported a peace agreement in 1992, and now 13 years later, they are coming up with allegations of terrorism. Let me just refer to something that happened during the admissibility.
2 more minutes, okay?
Okay, yeah. I wanted to say that. Yeah, one thing that I want to point out is that during the admissibility hearings, we asked these questions. Not even the United Nations had ever referred to FMLN as a terrorist organization. We presented proof that there is no allegations of that. The adjudicator asked the Minister Representative about that, and you know what the Minister Representative said? She said nothing, because there are no arguments about this. FMLN is not a terrorist organization. It's not considered a terrorist organization, and we all have the right to rebel against that kind of situation. So I just wanted to share this, and I guess that more information will be coming. We are learning from everybody, and we hope that we can resolve something over here. Thank you very much.
Charlotte Cates, and Charlotte is a long-time Palestine solidarity activist. She currently works with the Boycott Israeli Apartheid campaign in Vancouver, and also SAMIDOUN, which is an organization in solidarity with Palestinian political prisoners. Charlotte also brings her experience as a lawyer in the US and a member of the National Lawyers Guild, which is a progressive lawyers organization to this issue. So.
Thank you, and thank you to ILPS and to all of the other sponsoring organizations for having me here as part of the program, because it's a really important conversation and one that we need to have in our communities, especially as we come together from communities of resistance and communities of struggle, that we think about how we can work together, both to support each other in our struggles, but also to defend each other against criminalization and oppression, because it's something that's had a tremendous impact on organizing around Palestine, particularly in the past 10 years, but really throughout the history of the Palestinian struggle. So since the first part of Palestine was occupied in 1948, mass political imprisonment has been a fact of life for the Palestinian people. When the State of Israel was created in 1948, all Palestinians who remained in the land after over 750,000 people were ethnically cleansed were placed under martial law and were placed under military rule, the same kind of military rule that we see today in the West Bank. Since 1967, when the West Bank and Gaza were occupied, we've seen even a greater increase in what that military law and what that martial law looks like for Palestinians. Since 1967, over 700,000 Palestinians have been placed into Israeli jails, Israeli occupation jails, Israeli military jails. 40% of Palestinian men from the West Bank have spent time in Israeli detention. 1 out of 4 Palestinians of all ages in occupied Palestine have spent time in Israeli prisons. And so what mass imprisonment has become for Palestinians under occupation is just as much as checkpoints and the wall and ethnic cleansing and home demolitions and land confiscation, and perhaps in even more long-lasting manner, mass imprisonment has become a fact of life. There's not a Palestinian family that doesn't have a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a son, or a daughter in an occupation prison, or who's a veteran of an occupation prison. And just as Palestinians under occupation face a variety of enemies and a variety of oppressors who have kind of worked together to institute that occupation over the past 63 years, from Zionism, the idea that there should be an exclusivist Jewish state on occupied Palestinian Arab land, to US imperialism, British imperialism, and its partners around the world, to Arab reactionary states that kind of exist as puppets of those imperial powers, to those few kind of Palestinian forces who are willing to serve as comprador forces or as security forces for the occupation. And just as much as all of those enemies are the forces that the Palestinian popular movement are confronting, all of those forces are also responsible for political imprisonment against the Palestinian people. And every single one of those locations is a site of political imprisonment for Palestinians. And so in much the same way, every sector of the Palestinian people have been affected by political imprisonment. There are three kind of sectors of the Palestinian people when we think about how we describe who Palestinians are and where they're from. So there are Palestinians who were driven out in al-Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, those 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees, who today are over 6 million people, with those refugees and their descendants both living in refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza, in Arab countries surrounding Palestine, and in exile and diaspora around the world, here in Canada and the US and Europe and Latin America and many other places. Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, some of whom are also refugees who were expelled from 1948 Palestine, and Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Palestinians from occupied Palestine 48, who, at least in kind of the popular mythology around Israel, have equal rights and equal citizenship. And when Israeli government forces say Arabs are treated better here than in other countries, they're talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel, who themselves in imprisonment, just as in around 40 other spheres of life, suffer from institutionalized discrimination, racism, and apartheid. And so we see every single sector of the Palestinian people also represented in political imprisonment as well. And again, this is something that extends to men and women, elders and children. There are over 200 child prisoners at the moment. While Israelis are considered to be adults at the age of 18, Palestinians are considered to be adults at the age of 16. In Israeli military courts, which, by the way, West Bank settlers are not actually held under, despite the fact. So you could have in the West Bank, just to give as kind of an example, a 16-year-old girl was arrested for attempting to stab a settler, an illegal occupying settler on confiscated Palestinian land in the West Bank. She was given 7 years in prison, even though she didn't manage to successfully stab the settler. Whereas there have been settlers who have killed Palestinian children and were given less than 6 months in prison, 1 month in prison, or community service as the sentence for their criminal actions, because the settlers were given access to the Israeli civilian criminal justice system, whereas Palestinians, even though struggling against settlers, were given access only to the military court system. And just in the same way as Palestinian political prisoners represent all sectors of society, they also represent all factions and all areas of the political movement of resistance against Israeli occupation. So when we hear about Fatah and Hamas and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Islamic Jihad and all of the Palestinian factions that kind of collectively together make up the Palestinian National Movement for Liberation, every single one of those organizations has hundreds, if not thousands, of prisoners within the jails of the occupation. And so when we hear about things like the Palestinian Authority, and we look at the role that the Palestinian Authority is playing actually in holding Palestinian political prisoners of its own, as serving as security forces for the occupation, at the same time, Fatah, the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority, has thousands of its members in Israeli occupation jails and prisons struggling for their freedom. And we see that Palestinian national leaders are in prison, Palestinian scholars, Palestinian writers, Ahmed Sadat, the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Marwan Barghouti, a leader of Fatah, Abdulaziz Douek, who's a Hamas leader and also the Speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, and 24 other members of the Palestinian Legislative Council are held in Israeli occupation prisons. And they're held for all sorts of charges, anything from being a member in an illegal organization, which, much like the terrorists that we see now, embraces the broad array of Palestinian organizations, not only political parties and political factions, but also unions, student organizations, women's groups. Every kind of sectoral organization is listed on this list of hostile or illegal organizations under Israeli occupation. And so when we look at why are Palestinian prisoners held in prison, we can see that they're held in there for all forms of resistance, from taking up arms to protesting in the street to simply refusing to leave their land in the face of settlers' land confiscation and the building of the apartheid wall. So, because in Palestine, continuing to exist as a Palestinian and refusing to leave the land is resistance. And existence is resistance, and just as existence is resistance, Palestinian existence is criminalized. It is criminalized in Israel and is increasingly being criminalized around the world. When we look at the security that we look at Palestinian citizens of Israel, they're classified as security prisoners versus civil prisoners or criminal prisoners. And security prisoners are subject to the same kinds of laws that we see Palestinians in the West Bank and kidnapped from Gaza and considered unlawful combatants, given that the same form of treatment within the courts, where evidence based on torture is allowed. Secret evidence and secret evidence files are allowed into the court. Many Palestinian prisoners never see or hear any evidence against them, nor do their lawyers, because they are being held under secret evidence and their convictions are based on secret evidence. And one of the kind of prime examples of secret evidence in Palestinian prisons that we've been hearing about recently is administrative detention. Administrative detention is a form of imprisonment of Palestinians that the Israeli military uses, and it's existed since the British Mandate. So much as Gord mentioned earlier, going back to the British and the legacy of British colonialism, we see the same thing in Palestine applying to political imprisonment there. Palestinians can be held indefinitely for 6-month renewable periods under administrative detention with no charges, no trial, and nothing but secret evidence against them. Many people have heard about the recent hunger strikes by Khader Adnan and Hannah Shalabi. Both of those Palestinian prisoners were being held under administrative detention with no charge and no trial. There are 8 more hunger strikers that are currently on hunger strike who are also under administrative detention. The 2 longest striking of those have now been on hunger strike for 48 days, and so are also reaching critical points themselves. And when we look at administrative detention, we see that it's an entire structure that exists, that any Palestinian anywhere can be picked up, thrown in prison, and that the government and that the Israeli military does not have to be accountable for that person's detention. And so it's the ultimate right to criminalize Palestinian existence simply for being on the land. At the same time, though, when we hear about administrative detention and we hear about detention without trial, it's actually really important to keep in mind that the solution to administrative detention and detention without trial is not if they have something, if they can show that she's a member of Islamic Jihad, why don't they just put her on trial? Because that in itself is the problem. Administrative detention is just another level of the same mechanism of criminalization that exists in the military courts. Ahmed Sadat, the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Palestinian political prisoner sentenced to 30 years in prison and who has currently been in isolation cell for over 3 years, said when he faced the military court, as for your judicial apparatus, which is where this court comes from, it is one of the instruments of the occupation whose functions is to give the image of legal legitimacy to the occupation and allows the imposition of these systems on our people by force. And so when we look at what are the military courts, they're nothing more than an arm of the occupation. They're a tank, they're a bulldozer, they're a settlement. The military courts are all of those things. They're lawless courts. They exist under arbitrary military regulations, 2,500 of them that can be changed at any time by the regional military commander. They have 3 judges, only 2 of which are required to have any legal training at all, and exist within the structure of the military command. And, when I was in Palestine in 2007 as part of a US lawyers and activists delegation, I observed a military trial, actually the military trial of Ahmed Sadat. And one of the things that was really apparent in that trial, that mockery of a trial, was conducted entirely in Hebrew, and of course almost all of the Palestinians and Arabs present did not speak Hebrew and only spoke Arabic, and many Palestinians who have learned Hebrew have learned it through contact with the prison system. That there was utter contempt and disregard for Palestinian identity and existence. When one prisoner who was kind of being brought in order to provide testimony that Ahmed Sadat was in fact the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, something which had been, published in news articles around the world and was hardly a secret or something that needed to be proven. This person said, oh, what's he a member of? And he said in Arabic, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And the military judge, even though they had this prisoner there being somewhat compliant in front of them, said, what's Palestine? What's that? I've never heard of that thing. And the prisoners and the judges joined together to berate the prisoner for identifying the name of the Palestinian resistance organization of which Ahmed Sadat was the general secretary. And that was just kind of one example of how Israeli military courts function and why trying Palestinians can never be a solution to the crime of administrative detention, and that both of them are part of the same structure of repression, criminalization, occupation, and colonialism. And I just...
Charlie, you have 1 minute.
Okay, great. So, and actually, that's a really good point to make. I'll sum up really quickly, which is to say that what Gord brought up earlier about settler colonialism here in Canada also applies to settler colonialism in Palestine. And we've heard about these other examples in terms of fighting deportation here in Canada as part of kind of the results of a struggle against a neo-colonial regime that served as in very close contact with the United States and against what's been happening in the Philippines, also through a neo-colonial relationship with U.S. imperialism. We've seen that political imprisonment and struggle against it is part of that entire structure. And it's something that's also coming here as well. So in the U.S., we've seen cases against Palestinian activists from Sami al-Arian to the Holy Land Five to 23 international solidarity activists currently facing a grand jury for suspicion of quote-unquote material support to terrorism. And material support, at least in the U.S. and Canada, it hasn't quite had its definition broadened just as much yet under law, because in the U.S. currently, even coordinating advocacy with a group on the terror list could send you to jail for a minimum of 15 years under the rubric of material support to terrorism. And every major Palestinian political party, except for Fatah, is listed on the terrorist list of both Canada and the U.S. And both of them also list the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which is Fatah's armed wing, which is always accused of having direct relationship to the central political office of Fatah. And the reason why that's relevant is because no one who's been put on trial for these things in the States has been tried for giving money to, say, Hamas. They've been put on trial for giving money to a popular organization that's accused of having connections with it. So effectively, by the inclusion of that military organization on the list, every single Palestinian organization, including the political party most associated with the PA, is on the anti-terror list in the US and Canada. And it speaks to the reason why we need to fight these lists, to fight the use of illegal organizations, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Palestine, and whether it's in Canada or the US, and stand together to stop the terror list, engage in delisting campaigns, fight criminalization, fight colonialism and settler colonialism, and build a movement that's capable of doing that and joining our forces to really make radical change. Thank you again.
Our last speaker is Steve Da Silva, and he is a organizer from Toronto. He's a people's journalist, so he helps publish the newspaper Basics, which is a popular and grassroots news source for the people, and he's also the elected vice chairperson of the International League of People's Struggles Canada.
Thank you, Aiyanas, and thanks to all the preceding speakers. You've given us a lot of content to actually begin this discussion. I'll try not to take up too much time. However, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the campaign that ILPS Canada is developing, is proposing as a unifying campaign for our member organizations across the country. And I'm not even sure if everybody is aware of what ILPS Canada is. So by way of introduction, I'll just begin by quickly saying that ILPS Canada is a cross-country chapter that unites mass organizations, member organizations of the International League of People's Struggles, which is an international anti-imperialist formation of people's organizations across the world that are fighting and resisting imperialism in all its expressions. And as you can get from some of the literature in the back, you can see that we have mass organizations all around the world that are united with the coalition on the basis of one of its 18 concerns, based on your sectoral interests or specific issues around which we unite together to confront imperialism. The Canadian chapter of ILPS recognizes Canada as an imperialist state. It's imperialist not only in relation to its external, its position in the International Division of Labor, but it's also imperialist in relation to the ongoing colonization and genocide against indigenous peoples and the domination and plunder it illegitimately exercises over the internal colonies within the borders claimed by Canada. This campaign, Its Right to Rebel, was something that was proposed in the lead up to the founding assembly of the Canadian ILPS, the Canadian chapter, and it's something that was taken up along with a series of other important issues at the founding assembly as a campaign that we would like to develop in order to begin spearheading resistance to Canadian imperialism with the member organizations that are currently part of ILPS Canada. I'll try to be as brief as possible as I can with this so that we can get into the discussion period. In essence, I think what this proposed and draft strategy document is trying to do is outline the general context in which the criminalization of the people in general, Palestinians, for example, working class people in poor neighborhoods across Canada. I've just seen the downtown east side for the first time. It's my first time here on the West Coast. It happens in Toronto and all throughout North America in poor racialized working class communities. The criminalization of the people in general, and most importantly, the criminalization of people's struggles in particular. And I say most importantly because it's when the people decide to rebel, right? It's when the people go into rebellion that we begin to catch a glimpse of the possibilities of our liberation. So while we must oppose in general the criminalization of people, it's the criminalization of people's struggles that when we begin to dissect and pick apart this issue, we catch a glimpse of the general system of imperialism and how it is criminalizing us. So to give a bit of an overview of this document, our speakers here today have touched on the various ways in which them as individuals or the movements that they support or they're speaking about are criminalized. There are other examples we can give in Canada that reveal how the Canadian state, particularly at this juncture of history, when it finds itself in economic crisis, the Canadian state and its economy is intertwined and tied up with international economic system, one that I would call imperialist. The capitalist system internationally is an imperialist system with oppressed nations and oppressor nations, and Canada slots into the oppressor nations in that international division of labor. And as such, it plays a very proactive role, particularly in the last decade we've seen, in criminalizing people's movements around the world, in being a staunch and unwavering defender and supporter of countries like Israel, Colombia, Sri Lanka, and other regimes of state terror, and complementary to supporting these regimes, criminalizing people's struggles around the world, especially more proactively in the last 10 years since the beginning of the war on terror. So Charlotte brought up some of the Palestinian organizations that are listed as terrorist organizations here in Canada. When we take a look at the list of organizations that are listed as designated terrorist organizations here in Canada, we see a whole slew of organizations, dozens and dozens of organizations, most of which to the average person will appear as Islamic terrorist organizations. Many of the organizations on that list are marginal, insignificant, maybe carried out one action here, one action there in the past few decades. But there's a number of organizations on that list which are not marginal, cannot be listed as terrorist organizations for some of the reasons that Miguel pointed out a little earlier, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and another a set of other international laws, that these are legitimate people's movements, and these are legitimate belligerents according to international law. And what we've seen since 2001 is a move internationally and at the level of the state in each country across the world, at the initiative of imperialism, to criminalize people's movements, to list them as terrorist organizations, and to put them outside the boundaries of the law. So you get these absurdities like Charlotte was describing, like Jose was describing, where now in Canada, I'm not sure what you had mentioned, an aspect of Canadian immigration law where anybody who was ever associated with an armed movement at any period of time is considered to be a terrorist. So this really speaks to the, I think it speaks volumes about the intentions of the Canadian state at this period of time, but in essence all throughout its history, but at this period of time when it's a consolidated imperialist state, that it is seeking to criminalize anybody ever associated with resistance movements, in some cases armed resistance movements, as terrorists. The absurdity of that is that, as so well illustrated in the case of the Salvadorian community, is that that would literally criminalize and render terrorist 150,000 Salvadorian people, or probably the better part of that 150,000. What ILPS Canada believes is necessary to do at this moment is to advance this campaign to demonstrate how people struggles around the world and in Canada are being criminalized under criminalized through terrorist designations and through the general kind of legislative and juridical apparatuses that are being developed, particularly since 9/11, but going back much earlier than that, of course, in order to criminalize people's struggles. I've been given a difficult task here of trying to sum up. I'm just really overwhelmed by all these, these anecdotes and these the presentations that have been made here today. And I would encourage people to check out our document, take it home with you, read it more thoroughly, and consider the campaign that we're putting forward. At this moment, what we're looking to do is, with the member organizations of ILPS Canada and any other individuals and mass organizations across the country, perhaps not yet part of ILPS or not interested in joining right now, we would like to unite our organizations and the people's struggles to confront the criminalization of the people in general and people's struggles in particular, including the delisting, including individual cases like Jose Figueroa. And the way we see this unity being achieved is by identifying our common enemy. Being Canadian imperialism and imperialism in general, identifying that what the unifying factor in the criminalization of our disparate and distinct struggles and cases is that as imperialism continues to go deeper and deeper into its crisis, it's resorting to criminalization as a way to contain and ultimately criminalize the struggles of our basic existence up to and including our right to rebel. And as Gordon mentioned, this is something that has not just come about in the last few years. This goes back decades and even centuries. I'm glad he brought up the examples from the 1970s onwards, the liberation struggles that were criminalized. This document particularly details the way in which the war on terror and the absurd cases here in Canada that have been showcased as really a whole lot of bogeys in order to legitimize the war on terror and to delegitimize so-called terrorists through these cases that are pretty bogus, actually. But coming back to the points that Gord was making a little earlier, we see how back in the 60s and 70s, the war on drugs was used as a simultaneous way to blunt people's struggles by flooding poor and working class communities with crack cocaine, with drugs, also giving, taking some of the steam out of the militancy of the movements at that time by giving some people in the poor communities and working class communities an option of turning to the drug trade as a form of survival. Of course, these things are also tied up with international developments. We know how the drug trade was used to fund some of these right-wing terrorist organizations in Central America and Latin America, and ultimately contain and repress movements like the American Indian movement and the Black Panther Party especially. And then the war on drugs became a mechanism by which just working class communities were, racialized working class communities especially, were just wholly criminalized and delegitimized as a way to fill our prisons, as a way to contain working class movements from developing from that period onwards. From 2001 onwards, what we see is the war on terror has served as a complementary strategy to continuing to contain people, Muslims in general, anybody who can be perceived as being, potentially from a place where there might be terrorists. It's just a sweeping kind of campaign to criminalize immigrants, refugees, and peoples who, in the racist imaginary of the Canadian state and its media could be, associated with so-called quote-unquote terrorists. So these two complementary strategies have been used and continue to be used by imperialism to criminalize our struggles. I think I'm going somewhat in circles at this point. There's so much really to say on this topic, and maybe we can have a more focused discussion come out in the question and answer period. But just by way of conclusion, 1 minute. The next steps that we're looking to take here in Canada is to develop this campaign, It's Right to Rebel. This document is just a proposal at this point. It's been drafted over the last couple months. It's something that we're using right now to organize meetings like this across the country, to develop local committees, to refine and continue developing the strategy so that we can hopefully, what's anticipated is that we can have a conference at the end of 2012, bringing together activists and mass organizations around this campaign and around the country at the end of the year so that we can actually firm up our strategy and move forward with confronting Canada's war on terror and decriminalizing the people and people's struggles. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
How we can build this campaign. I think there's been a really rich discussion about it from the panel presenters, but there's a lot to figure out in terms of what are the best strategies that we can use to take on this legal framework, but also what are the strategies that we can actually take into our communities and talk to people about, because like Gord said in his presentation, the core of this is to try to delegitimize people's actual right to rebel and engage in struggle for a better world. So we need tools to challenge that, and tools that we're actually going to be able to talk to our brothers and sisters and parents and friends and family about.